Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. Hope everyone is well. So I popped out just for an hour. I just grabbed my Nikon Z8 and my 500mm PF to see if I get some shots. But there's nothing about, it's too windy. So I thought I'd make a video that I've been planning for a while. So it's now middle April. In about 3 or 4 weeks time, it would have been about a year since I got my Nikon Z8, and it got me thinking, because I think it was also around May time that I picked up my OM1. So I've had the OM1 coming on 3 years, and I've had the Nikon Z8 coming on 1 year. And I wanted to do a video just talking about some of the similarities, some of the differences between the two cameras when it comes to bird photography. I'm not going to be talking about macro, I'm not going to be talking about landscape, just bird photography. Because that's what I use both of those setups for 85% of the time, I would say. They are both fantastic setups. Now, since I've got my Nikon a year ago, I definitely have been using that most of the time. It is my go-to. I just grab it. As I said, I've just popped out near the house, so I didn't even take a bag. I just grab this and bring it with me. But it doesn't mean that I've given up on my OM1. I absolutely haven't. They both have their own strengths, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to go through a few of the strengths and possible weaknesses that either setup may or may not have. And then I'm going to go back to the computer and try to illustrate what I'm talking about using photos that I've taken with both setups. So this is not a comprehensive review. This is basically just my impressions after using both setups extensively for bird photography. Now, just to start, with the OM1, I use it almost always with the 300mm and sometimes the teleconverter. So those are native lenses. With the Nikon, I don't have a Z-mount birding lens. So I've used it with my 500mm PF and occasionally the 300mm 2.8, which are both adapted using the FTZ adapter, which works great. As far as I'm concerned, the FTZ adapter doesn't slow down the autofocus. No, I don't know that because I haven't used a Z-mount birding lens, but I have used a Z-mount 50mm 1.8 and the 24-70mm f4, and I think the 500mm is as snappy as those lenses, and it is certainly as snappy as my 500mm PF was when I used it on the Nikon D500, which was a really fast focusing camera. So in terms of reaction speed, I have no issues, but what it does do is it adds not an insignificant size to the lens, and it weighs a little bit. It's not really heavy, but that is something to bear in mind. Now, I don't care. I've got completely used to it, but that might be an issue for some people. So I'm going to start with the OM1 and go through some things that I like about the OM1. Of course, its size. It is compact and lightweight, and that teleconverter adds no extra weight or size really, and it gets you out to about 840mm equivalent. So in terms of portability, the OM1 cannot be beaten. It's super small, super light. The teleconverter doesn't really add any weight or length. It's so compact, but also at the same time really, really robust, really, really well made, and got really great weather sealing. So I think in terms of build quality, the OM1 is an absolute winner, and I understand why a lot of elderly people who don't want to carry around too much go for a micro four thirds setup. Now, to me, this isn't heavy, and I don't mind carrying it, and I actually have a battery grip on it because I like how it feels. But if I take that off and leave just the Nikon Z8 with this lens, it isn't a heavy lens. It's not a particularly heavy setup, but it's not as light as the OM1. Another thing I like about the OM1, 50 frames a second in RAW with continuous autofocus. That is amazing, and the Nikon has 20 frames a second, which is great, but 50 frames a second is 50 frames a second. So if there's a scene like a diving kingfish or a diving osprey, that 50 frames a second is absolutely fantastic. And because the camera is only 20 megapixels, it doesn't use up a huge amount of space, whereas at that speed, a high megapixel camera, you'd just run out of cards so quickly. So speed is also great on the OM1. Another thing the OM1 is great at is the Pro Capture. The Pro Capture is brilliant, and Nikon has its own Pro Capture, but it's only in JPEG, and as a result, they aren't really comparable. The Nikon one you can use in a pinch, I did a video about it, but the OM1 Pro Capture is quite a bit ahead of the Nikon one, and it is a fantastic feature when wanting to take birds and taking off or landing on a perch or something. I've used it for insects in flight, for birds in flight. Brilliant feature, the Pro Capture. The crop factor is, people spend ages talking about it online. I don't understand most of it. I ignore that. But it does mean that you are filling the frame a lot more with birds. So a 300mm is equivalent to 600mm on a full frame. It means you're getting a longer lens, in theory, on a smaller package. Very useful for bird photography. Depth of field, increased depth of field. Now, micro four thirds can be a pro and can be a con in this case. Like when you're taking a bird in flight with a far off background, an increased depth of field is really useful. You can shoot at f4, but you still get that high shutter speed because it's f4, but you get an f8 equivalent depth of field. So you're going to get more of the bird in focus. Now the downside of that is, if you want to photograph a small bird on a perch and you're quite far away from it, if you've got a full frame sensor, a large aperture is going to blur the background way more than a micro four thirds. So people often think, well, micro four thirds means you get more depth of field, so it's going to be worse. It depends on the situation. Birds in flight, I think it can really work as long as you've got the background quite far away. It depends on what you photograph, how you're going to view that. Some people see it as a con, some people see it as a positive. I see it as a positive in certain situations. The flip out screen on the OM1 is the best flip out screen I've ever used. I love it. It's so easy, it's so practical, and to me that's a real plus, and I use it a lot. And a lot of people don't really talk about flip out scenes, but I love this Nikon, but this flip out screen to me is it's just not as practical. I don't particularly like this. I use it still all the time, and it does a job. It's not terrible, but it's not as good as the one on the OM1 in my opinion. OM1 takes SD cards. For some people that's really great because it's convenient. If you travel somewhere and you've forgotten your cards, you can buy an SD card anywhere. So that is convenient, and the SD cards work in conjunction with the 20 megapixel sensor, so it's never an issue. If you've got a UHS-2, the speed is absolutely fine to have it, and you've got a large buffer, you can take a load of shots. So SD cards, for some, are a big positive. The teleconverter is definitely a plus on the OM1. It's tiny, it's light, and you can shoot it wide open, and it's still very sharp. Very little loss in terms of image quality on the teleconverter on the OM1. I keep it on most of the time. Really good little addition to the 300mm f4. And I'm sure I'm missing some, but the last thing I'll say is battery life. The battery life on the OM1 for a mirrorless camera is really good. I have a couple of spares, but you can get a lot of shots on one battery. And if I go out for a couple of hour session, often don't get through a battery. Right, let's look at the Nikon. The first thing that's obvious, but the sensor. It's nearly a 50 megapixel sensor. It takes incredible images, and you've got so much scope to crop. So it's only 500 millimeters. So in today, a lot of people use a lot longer than lenses. All the standard zoom lenses go to 600 millimeters. So this is a bit shorter. But for me, most of the time, it's not an issue because you can crop and still maintain a lot of detail. That sensor produces beautiful images. Now, 20 megapixel compared to 50 megapixel sounds a lot. Actually, in a lot of cases, if you're close to a perched bird, you're not going to notice a difference. Both cameras produce extremely sharp shots. Birds in flight, to me, is where I really notice the difference. There's just more detail on the Nikon shots for the average bird in flight shot. I've taken a lot of great bird in flight shots with OM1, but I prefer the Nikon generally for birds in flight. Now, the other side of depth of field, the Nikon being a full frame sensor can give you beautiful bokeh if the bird is relatively close and the background doesn't need to be as far away. So you can get absolutely great bokeh with the OM1. You just got to work a little bit harder and plan your shots a little bit more. But if you're shooting a bird from the same distance and the background isn't too far from the bird, and you've got the Nikon and you've got the OM1, you're going to get a more pleasing background with the Nikon. High ISO. Obviously, this is, anyone who knows about photography knows that a full frame sensor is going to have less noise. Now, I think the OM1 actually performs brilliantly in terms of noise. Way better than I thought. And I did a video where I took a number of shots at 12,000 ISO. With all the modern denoise programs that are available, noise is not quite the issue that it was. And, 10,000 ISO, 12,000 ISO can clean up pretty well on OM1. But it doesn't compare to a Nikon. And I've done 24,000 ISO on the Nikon. Again, using denoise cleans up really, really nicely. And I could probably go higher than that, although I usually don't. So, you know, if you're in a really dark environment, the Nikon is going to beat the OM1. But the OM1 still does well. A little thing for me is I love the auto ISO switch. So on the Nikon dial, so if I hold the ISO button down and I do the rear dial, that will go from 100 to 200 to 400 to 800, right? But if I go and do the front dial at one click, you hear that? So that will switch it from ISO auto to just the ISO. And I find that super useful. There's probably a way to do it in the OM1, but I haven't worked it out. So in the OM1, if I want to go from ISO 1600 all the way to auto ISO, I've got to go on and just do the dial all the way down. Waste a lot of time. Here, I can go ISO, I'm on auto ISO, click it, I'm on ISO 4000. Click it again, ISO auto. That to me, I use all the time, super convenient. CF Express cards. Some people absolutely love them. Since I got this, I bought a few and I do really like it. One issue though is I have had overheating issues with CF Express cards on this. Now that's maybe because I haven't bought the best cards. They are super expensive, but I have had issues before. Obviously SD cards on the OM1, I've never had anything overheating, never an issue. And because I don't have the most expensive, fastest ones, sometimes the buffer does run out. But the one I'm using mainly is my Lexa 500 gigs, and it does seem very sturdy. I don't think that's going to break, and so far I've had it for a year and I'm pretty happy with it. I do see the appeal in CF Express cards. If you've got the more expensive ones, you're going to be able to take more shots, because 20 frames a second at 48 megapixels, that is a lot of data to the camera to be recording instantly. And an SD card, which this does take an SD card, but that's not going to keep up. So you need a CF Express card really for the Nikon Z8. Another thing, I prefer the viewfinder on the Nikon Z8. It's just clearer. The OM1's not bad, I don't mind it. It's just more beautiful to look at. It feels more responsive. I just prefer the viewfinder on this. So that's a few of the things just straight off the bat that I can think of right now. I've probably forgotten something, but what I'll do now is we'll go back to the computer and I'll try and illustrate what I've just said using a few photos I have taken with both setups. So here we are back at the computer, and let's look at a few photos and hopefully they will illustrate some of the points I made while talking in the car. Anyway, here's the first one. So here's a shot I took of an olive-back sunbird last summer in Thailand. Now, originally the shot I thought was a throwaway, and I'll show you why if we look at the original. Now here's the original shot, and as you can see, when I first looked at that after I took it, I thought that's a throwaway shot. Underexposed, masses of horrible looking background, and the bird was really small in the frame. Because it had its tongue out in an interesting pose, I thought, let's just see if I can crop it and get something usable out of it. I knew it'd have to be a huge crop because I wanted to minimize the background as much as possible. So what I did is I just brightened up the image, did a huge crop, and as you can see, nothing spectacular, but it did retain a lot of detail. That is a massive crop, and if you zoom in there, you can see lots of lovely detail. They're beautiful little birds. And this would not have been possible with the OM1. I could not have done that much of a large crop and retained as much detail as that. This is an example of where the Nikon Z8 and its huge sensor making something usable from an otherwise throwaway shot. Now this next shot was shot deep in the Malaysian jungle about 2 years ago, and I knew it was going to need a really high ISO. I definitely didn't have a tripod. I might have had sort of a vlogging monopod, which is very small. So basically, I'm pretty sure this was handheld, which is usually how I take photos anyway. So basically what I did, I was deep in the jungle. I took a load of high ISO shots just to get some that I could work with. And I thought, as the bird was stationary for quite a while, I thought, let's just try some low shutter speed shots. And this shot, if we go down, you can see is at 1/15 of a second with the OM1 and the 300mm f4 with the teleconverter. So that's the equivalent of 840mm at 1/15 of a second handheld. And as you can see, first up, the bird is absolutely stunning. But look at all that detail in there, and at 1/15 of a second. So here, the Olympus really shined. I would not be able to get that kind of focal length on the Nikon at 1/15 of a second. The image stabilization is good, but it's not that good. Now here are some shots of the Japanese white-eye, which is a small, cute little green bird, very small and very fast. They never stay still. And the Sakura. Now these were all taken a couple of years ago with the OM1, and I was really happy with these shots. I knew the background wasn't going to be much of a problem because I had already established which flowers I was going to focus on and waited for the birds to go to those particular flowers. Now, in this case, the OM1 did absolutely brilliantly, but on occasion, I want to get a bird and have a completely diffused sea of pink all around the bird. And it's very difficult getting that shot because you always get little branches and distracting things. And years ago when I started photography, I was just happy to get a sharp picture of a bird with also some sakura. But nowadays, I'm not interested in that. I know exactly what kind of shot I want. And this year, I was able to do that. So this shot here, I took this year. And basically, again, I pre-planned these shots. These are not by chance, but I had focused on these flowers and I wanted the bird to come and I wanted that diffused pink background. And this shot worked really nice. Now, it's not to say this is impossible with the OM1, but it is definitely easier with the full frame sensor of the Nikon Z8. And I love this picture. It just gives a sense of these birds getting lost amongst these pink flowers. But it is very easy for the background to be relatively distracting as well, with lots of little branches. And this one, I managed to get a shot where you don't notice the branches. And this was with the 500mm 5.6 1600 per second ISO 3600. I think it would have been difficult to get this shot with the OM1. I sometimes like to go to the ocean, to mud flats when the tide goes out, and see if I can get shots of small shorebirds. Now, it's really difficult. You have to get very low down. You have to creep out. Hopefully you can get close. And I usually end up getting wet. My gear sometimes gets wet and my back aches because I'm leaning down. I'm not lying on the ground, but I'm basically kneeling down and I'm looking down into the flippy screen. And this was a shot I took a couple of days ago of a greater sand plover. These birds are usually white for most of the year, but as breeding season approaches, they get this beautiful color. And I took this with the Nikon Z8 and the 500mm PF and the 1.4 teleconverter. And there's loads of detail there, and it's a nice shot. I like this shot. But this was a lot more difficult than taking a similar shot with the Olympus setup. With the teleconverter on the Nikon setup, this was relatively heavy. And my fault, I kept the battery grip on. So every time I would hold the camera set up just above the water, the bottom of the battery grip kept getting wet. But also the setup was a lot heavier. And you're basically waiting. This bird is walking really fast in front of me. And it was always looking away from me. It was only occasionally that it would turn sideways and I could get a profile like this. And it took ages and my back was really hurting. Kneeling down, leaning over, and the Nikon setup did feel pretty heavy to me on this instance. So here are a couple of shots I took about a year ago at the same location, but using the OM1 setup. And the OM1 with the 300mm f4 and the teleconverter was a lot lighter. And I think I even took some of these shots with one hand. And the flippy screen is just so useful. It's so much easier to use on the OM1. And I can just hold the camera with one hand just above the water. I can creep because it's a lot lighter. I'm a lot more mobile. And this shot and this shot taken on the same day. And because you're that low down, the sensor doesn't really matter because the background is still distant and nice and blurred out. So you can get great shots with both setups, low down taking of small shorebirds. But it is easier with the OM1 just because of its size and weight. Yeah, so if you're shooting low shorebirds, I find the OM1 for me is a little bit easier, but you can get great shots with both setups. Right, I have two similar shots that were taken in roughly the same location about 6 months apart. One was with the OM1 setup and one was with the Nikon Z8 setup. And they are both very similar. And this just illustrates that in this type of shot, if you can get close enough with either setup, filling the frame, the detail is roughly the same. You are going to get great shots with both setups. It doesn't really matter. Both are really nice, really sharp, capture the action. And of course, when the bird dives in to grab the fish, that all happens very quickly. Because I was close enough, filled the frame, in this situation, you're not going to notice a difference between the setups. You can get great shots with either. This one was the OM1, and this one was the Nikon. Now, I really think the OM1 and the 300mm f4 really shines when it comes to slightly larger than macro-sized animals, like moths, butterflies, dragonflies, reptiles, frogs. The OM1 is really great because it's got that 1.3 meter minimum focusing distance. And I thought that that was easily going to be better than the Nikon. So here's a shot with the OM1. These hummingbird hawk moths are super fast. And again, I focused on the flower with a distant background so I could get a nice clear shot. And I love this, but I'll just show another photo that I took this year with the Nikon setup. And I also really like that. And the image itself is really nice with lots of detail. And again, I think this speaks to the sensor. The fact that I couldn't get as close as I could with the OM1 setup. But even with the 500mm and I was further away, because of that 48 megapixel sensor, I could crop. And I'm really happy with the final result. So the 500mm has surprised me in that sense. I didn't think it was going to be anywhere near as good as the Olympus 300mm f4 for photographing butterflies and dragonflies. But it surprised me how well it's done. To me, where I see the biggest difference is for birds in flight, especially fast birds in flight, ospreys, kingfishers. With the OM1, I've taken some great shots of ospreys and kingfishers, but when I take the same species with my Nikon, I just see more detail and I just prefer how the shots come out. That doesn't mean the shots are bad with the OM1, they're absolutely not. Here's a shot I took last year and I was really lucky to be close to the bird. And there's a lot of detail there. This is with the OM1, the 300mm and the teleconverter. And it's a pretty good shot. Unfortunately, this winter, I hardly saw any ospreys. I went to the same location dozens of times where this shot was taken, trying to see them, and only saw 2 diving sequences the whole winter of ospreys. This was one of them. I didn't have the right lenses on it. This was with the 300mm 2.8 and the teleconverter. I was just trying out the teleconverter, but still the detail there is much better. There is so much detail there, and I just don't get quite that same level of detail with the OM1. So that's where I notice the difference with birds of flight. I notice more detail diving kingfishers and ospreys. So in summary, I don't want to say one camera system is better than the other. They both do great jobs and they both have certain strengths, and depending on situations, they might not do as well as the other setup, but both are brilliant. I would recommend either to anyone who's interested in getting one of those setups. I usually just grab the Nikon because I just value that slightly better image quality in all genres. Now, it's marginal, and as I said, with stationary birds, you're not really going to notice it. If I suddenly have to take shots of birds in flight, I just prefer how Nikon files look, and that's just my opinion. I really hope you liked this video and you found something valuable in it. If you did, please give me a subscribe and a like and say hi in the comments. Otherwise, I'll see you on the next one. Take care. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.